2023. First item of business is the roll call. So we roll call first.
Yes, Dale should be taking care of that.
Yes, sir. We're still admitting a few people into the meeting, so. Okay. Jeff Sins is excused. Mike Williams,
Here.
Brian McCarthy,
Here.
Jonathan Scott,
Here.
Michael English, Cal Hardy, Robert Frey, Anna Quinones, Laura Lenhart is also excused, Gina Du, Christina Bolinois, Bob Campbell,
Here.
Jesus Peraza Garcia,
Here.
Rob Blossom, also excused, Frank Koffenauer, Jay Collins,
Present.
Jennifer Malone.
Here.
Marcela Jimenez Ramirez is also excused. Sarah Caper.
Here.
Let me do a quick count. We do not have an in-person quorum, correct?
Alex Henry, representing the city of Tampa is here, and we do have 9 in the room.
Okay, then we do have an in-person quorum.
Right, thank you. Next item of business is public comment. Is there anyone here to speak to public comment? We have more people than we normally have today, but I think we have a guest speaker. Anyone online? Okay, seeing none. Next, our special presentation, and I think Wade wanted to say a couple things first. So Wade.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just 2 quick announcements. If you are not a committee member, we would ask that you sign in on the sign-in sheet outside the door, although you can do it at your convenience. This presentation is approved for AICP and professional engineer credit. If you are seeking the PE hours on that, please email me following the presentation, and I will get you a certificate of completion for that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wade. And with that, we're going to have a special presentation today on the role and designs of arterial streets in Hillsborough County. And Ian Lockwood is here to speak. So Ian, if you kind of step up to the podium, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you for having me. Pleased to be here, and I'm going to share a bunch of ideas with you. I just want to make sure this mic works. Is it working fine?
Michael, can you confirm that everybody online and
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
we can hear. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm Ian Lockwood with Tool Design Group. We're about 320 people in about 20 offices around the country, and we do what we call livable transportation. And we don't build highways and we don't widen arterials, but we do remove highways and narrow arterials. And it's all about livability, walkability, pulling in investment, equity. These are the sorts of things that motivate us. Today, I'm going to be talking about arterial streets. This is a particular interest of mine, and you'll see why in a few minutes. I'm a civil engineer. I have a couple degrees in civil engineering, and I went to Harvard for a low fellowship where I studied the role of infrastructure in shaping cities. And so I got to study that for a year, and that was pretty exciting. And so I help cities around the country retool their infrastructure to achieve their community visions according to their community values. I'm going to start with this slide. So I was at an art gallery, and in the floor they had this exhibit called Perspective. And it was a set of tiles, and I didn't know what it was about, and I'm trying to figure out what these tiles meant. And I thought I could do a bunch of statistics and add up how many black tiles next to white tiles, or maybe just try and figure out how much light's reflected from different parts, but I couldn't understand it. So I took another picture with my camera, but when I was focusing, it went out of focus and it looked like this. That's the same picture, but out of focus. And I thought, wait a second, that looks like a person. And so I changed my position and it looked like that. So I went to the other side of the exhibit. And so it's Abraham Lincoln. And so I was thinking about it, I thought, when I was looking at all the detail, all the, call it data that was reflected off those tiles, I couldn't understand the picture. But when I blurred it, then the picture became clear, which is kind of a strange thing. And then when I got to the right part, I got the correct perspective. So I didn't have the right perspective and my focus was wrong. And so that's going to be a running theme of this presentation, is to think beyond the data, look at the patterns and consider your perspective. So this is from a convocation speech that Salman Rushdie gave. And he was talking to the graduating class about making a difference. And he said, in the years to come, you'll find yourselves up against all these gods, big gods and little gods, and they all demand to be worshipped and obeyed. And he was talking about money and power and convention and custom. And this will be taught to you, and it's designed to limit your thinking and control your thoughts. And he said, when you're up against those gods, he said, defy them. The people in the world who made the biggest difference defy these conventions and these gods. And when you look into history, some of the people that made the biggest difference in the world defied their gods. For example, the Copernicus, when he was an astronomer a long time ago, the Earth was in the center of the solar system, and people were trying to predict the orbits of the planets, but they always got it wrong because the central assumption was incorrect. And he thought the sun was in the middle. And when he did the math, everything worked out perfectly. And then with Jaeger, with supersonic flight, up until the Second World War, the best physicists in the world said going beyond the speed of sound was absolutely possible. It was a natural limit. And he proved them wrong. And now supersonic flight's a routine thing, even though he was absolutely nuts to suggest it in the late 40s. And then Picasso painted that picture on the left when he was a teenager. He could paint incredibly well. And when he decided to get into a sort of modern art, he was thought of as a crackpot, weird, but he was painting exactly what he wanted. That image on the right is exactly what he intended. And every great art teacher will say, one must master the conventions before defying them. So any monkey can throw paint at a screen and call it art, but he was actually intentional and made a contribution to the art world. And then there's been folks who have challenged the conventions in transportation planning, like Carmen Hausclau coined the term traffic calming in Germany in the early 70s. Hans Monderman created the idea of shared space, which was quite normal for thousands of years in cities, but we needed a term for it in the 80s so that we could write policy and start designing for that. Dan Burton coined the term traffic calming in 97 on our Olive Avenue project in West Palm Beach. And then Barbara McCann, it was only 2005 she coined the term complete streets. And that allowed all the cities and counties and states to write guidelines and so forth to advance that idea, which never wasn't coined up to that point. And there's so much more room for innovation and unconventional thinking in transportation planning, from the way we fund things to how we model things and plan transportation. So I think it's just the beginning of challenging the conventional paradigm, which I'll call it. So speaking of convention, it's the kind of the normal accepted way of doing things. Doesn't matter really what it is. Even Hollywood formal wear. There's a bunch of gentlemen in tuxedos, which is conventional what to wear at these award shows, and the women are all these beautiful gowns. But there's the odd person who comes who's unconventional. And when people do things unconventional, some folks get uncomfortable. It puts you off and creates discussion. It's edgy, it's innovative sometimes. And so I just wanted to make the distinction between conventional and unconventional. And then there's traditional, which you can't go wrong with James Bond tux or, one of those classic gowns. They'll always be in style for a long, long time. And the similar things happen in transportation planning. It's conventional to widen our arterial street when it gets really busy, or to use the functional classification system like highway, arterial, vector, local street. And that's just normal. We accept it. And then there's unconventional ideas coming out in transportation planning, like highway removals. And when this highway was removed in 2002 in Milwaukee, it was thought of as a weird idea. It was strange, and people felt really uncomfortable with it. And I'm working on 2 of those right now, and we've got proposals in for 4 more around the country. So highway removals will eventually be just a normal thing that happens in enlightened cities. And then shared space was weird in the 80s, but now it's becoming quite common. We just finished a plan to do the largest shared space in the United States on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, downtown Atlanta. So it's challenging people because there's no traffic control devices in those spaces, and they're incredibly safe. And so it challenges some of our conventional thinking, which makes some of our colleagues uncomfortable. And then there's the traditional, that fantastic network of streets that a lot of traditional cities have. And on the main street, that sort of intact 100% frontage of buildings, which creates an engaging walking environment. You just can't go wrong with those traditional ideas. I'm just going to go into the West Palm story. This is back in the 90s. I was the head of transportation for the city of West Palm Beach. And when I got there, it looked like the picture on the left. My predecessors since the 50s and 60s have been one-waying streets and speeding them up, and rewarding the long trip, the car trip, created barriers in our cities. It was difficult to walk. Most of the people with choice had left the city and moved out to the suburbs, became car dependent. We ended up tearing down half our buildings to make room for surface parking lots. And about 80% of our main shopping street was vacant. Our tax base was terrible. We had $7,000 in reserves. The city, we were broke. We had huge crime issues. And then the mayor at the time had a charrette, and during that charrette, they drew this beautiful set of drawings about the land use, about these buildings should be. And my job was to make the streets match that land use vision. Now, keep in mind, this is like 1996, and I was trained conventionally, like most of us in transportation engineering, where we were taught in school that value is a function of travel time. So it's your job to reduce what we call delays and fight congestion and keep things moving and reward traffic flow. That's what we were taught. And traditionally, the value of cities was a function of proximity to the core. The closer to the core, the more valuable the land. But my professors pounded it in us that you had to speed things up because that spread the value contours out. But what I was noticing in West Palm Beach was that it wasn't spreading it out at all. It was exporting it from the core to the suburbs and the exurbs. These streets that were being sped up became barriers and disadvantaged the businesses on the sides, and did a tremendous amount of harm to our city. For 30 years, they tried this, and the city kept getting worse and worse with this application of what I've now concluded is a flawed fundamental premise. Now, keep in mind, this was a brand new idea started by the modernists, completely untested. And now we've had a few generations of looking at it. I think it's becoming clear what's going on. And I'm going to go into that in more depth. So this is Dixie Highway. It goes the whole length of the country from the Keys right up to the north. And here I am trying to figure out on Sunday morning, how do I change this to match that really great land use vision? And I just concluded that too much space was being allocated to motorists, and they're going too fast, and they were creating a barrier, even though the convention was, and because this is a major arterial, you're supposed to reward through traffic and keep it flowing. I said, that is not doing our city a service, and it's actually damaging our downtown and our businesses and our identity and lots of other things. So I took away space, I took away a lane, and I raised all the intersections through the downtown. And I was told by some of my colleagues and the engineers at the county that you cannot raise a intersection on an arterial road. And we did it 25 years ago, and it's been fine. So apparently you can, and it was fine. And what happened was people started coming back, investment started coming back, the city started coming back to life. And so I did it again on Olive Avenue. This is the road that road diet was coined on. So it went from 5 lanes to 2 lanes, and suddenly the kids could walk to school. Neighbors knew their neighbors. They didn't know the neighbors before. It beautified the street. Walking became an option. And this was North 60 Highway. It was a 4 lanes. We made it 2 lanes with lateral shifts, built a linear park on the side. And right away, crime rates started going down. People started walking. Natural surveillance came up. An inline skating club was begun. And it was just beautiful. It was just attractive to change the identity of the city. So I thought, okay, every single time I take lanes off an arterial and slow it down and beautify it, businesses get better, quality of life gets better, time goes down. So I just kept doing that. And the city bounced back to life nicely, and now it has millions of dollars in reserves. It attracted several $1 billion worth of investment. So on these before and afters, all we did was deal with the public realm, make the streets beautiful, slow them down, and the private sector built all those buildings. So now we have this really beautiful mixed use downtown. Now, at the time, there was, keep in mind, 90s, complete streets was not, context sensitive design didn't exist. Road diet hadn't been coined at the time. All of these terms that we now use commonly didn't exist. So it was very hard for me to even express myself with technical language. And people looked at me like I was nuts, especially when I went to the DOT and said, hey, I'd like to narrow your state road. And they said, did you model it? And the county had this really incredible traffic demand forecast model, which said that if you did any of those things that you just saw, you would get catastrophic congestion. And so they fought me on all of that stuff. And I said, well, that's not my model. That's a model. And it's one version of the truth. And I said, my model is Copenhagen. And 20 years before I was doing what I was doing, they narrowed streets and slowed them down and took a incredibly automobile-oriented environment, which you see on the before pictures, and created a really livable, beautiful city. And where did the traffic go? It went the same place it did in West Palm Beach. We were all congested before with all those lanes. There's less lanes now, more land use, and the congestion's about the same. So I thought, okay, Copenhagen's the way to go. So that's the model that we followed. And then San Francisco in the 80s, the Embarcadero Highway fell down and they didn't replace it. Where'd the 120,000 cars a day go that was using it? There's more trips happening there now than ever before. Walking trips, tourist trips, bike trips, transit trips, car trips, every kind of trip. It's more vibrant, more active. It's a better city without the highway. So this got me to think, like, what should you believe? Should you believe what happens in real cities that you can actually see with real people making normal decisions? Or do you believe the traffic demand forecast model? Now, our firm does a lot of modeling. And so it depends on the context. If it's a big planning decision where it's shaping the future of the region or the city, you should look at the patterns. You should change your perspective and see what the pattern's telling you, not necessarily the data. The traffic demand model, its DNA is in reducing travel time. It's an automobile-oriented thing at its core. So if you have to make big planning decisions, use real cities as your model. If you're making operational changes, use the traffic demand forecast model. Milwaukee took out their highway, and what used to be best use on the waterfront, you can see in the upper right, is surface parking lots. And today, people live there and work there. Seoul, Korea took out this highway, restored their river. It's now the second biggest tourist attraction in Korea. And they didn't make up the car carrying capacity on other streets, but the entire city got better, more vibrant without that highway. Paris is removing they've already removed it on the Seine River. It's temporarily removed right now. It's going to be turned into a permanent park. They are narrowing the Champs-Élysées from 8 lanes to 4 and beautifying it, creating spaces for people. Next year, you will not be allowed to drive through downtown Paris. You can drive to and from, but you can't go through it. And they're removing 6,000 parking spaces. Now, this would boggle people's minds in American cities, but they've had 20 years head start on following their vision and not necessarily a traffic demand forecast model. So these cities align with what I call the traditional paradigm, which predates the car. Cities have been around for 10,000 years and have evolved over 400 generations to have the higher calling, the community vision, accommodating many users, making great places, rewarding short trips, nurturing businesses. That's the capacity of streets for social interaction. And the cities that do this the most, they have the strongest identity. They have better health. They're more vibrant. People have modal choices. You can drive, you can take transit, you can walk, you can bike. In short, they're excellent cities. And when you step back for a moment and you think about why we even have cities, it's to maximize social and economic exchange. It's bring people together for the exchange of all of these things on this list, from entertainment to services to culture to capital, all come together in cities. The transportation purpose of cities is actually to reduce long distance trips, is to bring people together. Because if we were spread out all over the landscape, like before cities were invented, it would be very inefficient and ineffective. And my profession has been trying to speed up traffic and reward long trips through highways and cities and big arterials, which has spread cities out and has made them ineffective and inefficient places. We use more energy and land for transportation than any place in the history of the world. So it's not efficient or effective. So that's why cities were invented. They're about efficiency. And the best cities in the world have this litmus test, and we call it the universal equation of land use and transportation planning. So if you look at any of the, Oslo, Copenhagen, increasingly places like Milwaukee and Seattle and these sorts of places, they advance the city through this equation, and they want their populations to grow. They want their economies to grow. So they want more trips. They want more social trips. They want more shopping trips. They want more cultural trips, tourist trips. They want lots of trips. And that's transportation for the economy. We want lots of trips. But they also want their traffic lower. They want less traffic, so less vehicle miles traveled. So how do you grow your economy and your population on one hand and lower your traffic on the other? Well, these cities are all doing it. So it's not like it's just theoretical. And how they do it is they change their modal split and they change their average trip length. And you can do that through transportation changes and land use changes. But I've just listed a whole bunch of those things underneath those metrics. So if you want a great place, a great city, use this litmus test. Use it for every single planning decision and transportation decision that you make from now on. And this place will become a better city over time, because that's how they do it. The modernists came up with a lot of theories in the 1910s, 1930s and popularized them. They got a lot of support from industries to make these normal, and they became very fashionable after World War II. Corbusier is one of the guys that was behind all this, and this is a famous quote of his: "Cars, cars, fast, fast." Very pithy, deep philosophical stuff there, right? And so Corbusier was an architect, and he came up with all kinds of ways of accommodating cars. Now, keep in mind, modernism came up with lots of cool stuff, like cool furniture and dance and music and so on. But when it came to city making, they really dropped the ball. And because of the speed of cars, they thought they could overcome proximity through speed. And so they had all these different ideas about different types of streets that violated 10,000 years of city making. It's brand new, untested ideas. And this was one of Corbusier's famous drawings, which really influenced our profession. And his idea was, all we have to do is connect these objects in the landscape with these high-speed streets, and these objects could be anywhere we wanted. Now we call them big trip generation or trip generators, like downtown and places like that. And so even today, when we get into the federal highways, functional classification stuff, that's one of their ideas, and it comes from drawings like this one. And again, it's about rewarding speed. Reducing travel time. The industrialists got behind this because they knew they'd sell a lot of cars, and it really captured people's imaginations. And Bel Geddes did this GM exhibit in New York in 1939, and people sat in these chairs and they went around this model and saw this future city with what they called magic motorways at the time, which became the interstate highways. And the big selling point was you could drive in the city and never have to stop. So think about that for a second. Like, pretty sick, right? But anyway, it captured people's imaginations, and that was the mandate following World War II. And Disney was a big show in the 60s and 70s. And this was their future with these sort of Jetson-like tubes that you could connect objects in the landscape and get around really quickly. You could go visit the Grand Canyon. You could go to Egypt and visit the Sphinx. You know, so many cool outcomes, right? On the left is one of the first drawings of the interstate system. And the idea was you'd get off the interchange and then the street would split and split and split and then enter into the street network, which respected what we call the transect. And so the highways were to connect places far away. And when you get to the city, you would respect the traditional network. But what happened was that the modernist thinking was, well, we got to connect objects in the landscape. So they plowed the highways right into downtown. So the second one is my Photoshop version of the first one. Peter Park was the guy behind the removal of the highway in Milwaukee. And he calls bringing highways into cities as America's failed infrastructure experiment. He said it was an experiment, it was completely untested, untried anywhere in the world, and it's caused an enormous amount of lowering of values and safety and quality of life and sprawl and car dependence and health issues. So he said it was an experiment and it didn't work out so well. And that's probably why we're doing so many highway rules now around the country. So speaking of transects, here's some transects. So there's transects for everything. So if you're working in an urban environment, you expect wider sidewalks and formal on-street parking, slower speeds, and nice paving materials, pedestrian scale lighting, formal planted trees in the edges, and a grid of streets. When you're in the suburbs, you expect narrow sidewalks, medium speeds, cobra headlights, informal landscaping, and a sort of dendritic street pattern. And in rural areas, everything all right?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay. And in the rural areas, you expect higher speeds, off-street parking, forests, very few pedestrians, and just a very sparse network of rural roads. And what's happened is that rural expectations have been imported into cities of high speeds and a dendritic hierarchy, which has done a lot of damage to cities because it violates the transect code. So this is called the tragedy of the commons. And thousands of years ago, there was a bunch of shepherds and they all had their own grazing grounds, but there's a common grazing ground that they could all use. And it was rational and in their self-interest to have their sheep graze as much as possible on the common grazing ground, because that would save their own fields for later in the year. But if they all acted rationally in their self-interest and maximized the feeding of their flocks in the common grazing ground, it would destroy it. And that became known as the tragedy of the commons. And so when you have these common interests, you have to manage them. And so the same thing is with fish. If everyone with a boat could catch as many fish as they wanted, we'd have no fish in the oceans anymore. And if anyone with a chainsaw could go cut and sell wood, our forests would be gone. So all of these sort of public goods have to be managed carefully. Now, when it comes to transportation, if you were to ask anybody in this room, do you want to be able to get to work faster rather than slower? They're going to say faster. It's rational in your self-interest to want to get somewhere faster. So doesn't it make sense that everybody wants to get places faster rather than slower? Now it's popular, but why don't we just speed up all the streets in the city? That way everybody can get everywhere faster rather than slower and be a lot happier, right? Now the assumption was that when the modernists sort of grabbed onto this idea of just speeding everybody up, that nothing else would change. You'd just be able to get places faster rather than slower. Unfortunately, though, everything changed. Land use planning changed, policies changed, parking stuff changed. And the cities that did this the most did the most damage to themselves and are probably the worst cities in the whole country. And the cities that didn't are the better cities with more equity, more effective transit, more affordability, that sort of thing. So it's called the tragedy of the commons. And so the conventional paradigm was this new paradigm that was invented and popularized before and just after World War II, where experts dictated things, and they used the traffic demand forecast model to override what would be normally common sense. Their problem definition is to fight congestion, increase speeds, and keep traffic moving. They were indifferent to land use. And the nice thing about it, though, is simple. It's very easy to explain in sound bites, which makes it easy to win debates because cities are complex and they simplified it. You want to get somewhere faster or slower? It was very simple. The capacity of streets was about just moving traffic as opposed to nurturing businesses and creating identity and all that. And the outcomes that the cities that do that the most are at the bottom. Poor health, limited options, lots of energy use, car dependency, and trouble with vibrancy. So this is Chattanooga, Tennessee. This about 20 years ago, and this is Riverfront Parkway. And it was blocking the city off from the waterfront. Fundamental access issue. They wanted access to the waterfront. And so we did a vision where we narrowed the street to 2 lanes and created walkways down to the waterfront and so forth. And oh my gosh, the Tennessee DOT didn't say no. They said, hell no, you're not doing that. They said the city's lifeblood is the highway, and the mobility it provides is important for economic health. You have to fight congestion, and removing it's anti-progress. The city was saying, no, it's fundamental to the place. The highway is not context sensitive, and we need to remove it for all sorts of reasons. And so it's a clash of paradigms. In fact, when you think of all the controversies in your county and your city, chances are there's a camp who have traditionally wired and a camp that's conventionally wired. And that's what it's about, which paradigm wins. These are proxy fights over which paradigm should win. And that's what happened in Chattanooga. And so there's the before picture. That's the aquarium. That's what we call a silver bullet. They built that downtown thinking that it would attract people and create economic vibrancy. But people just drove in and then drove out because they were completely missing the boat on terms of walkability and placemaking, which is what really attracts economic development. So, so that's the before picture. That's the after picture. So the big road's gone. Now it's people friendly. Now the Tennessee DOT actually agrees with the project because it's such a huge success. But it's attracted lots of jobs to downtown, lots of people and housing, and it's a much better city as a result. Nobody misses the highway. If you ask any of these people, they want the highway back. They would not want it back. It seems imperative when you have one because people use it, but it's absolutely not necessary to keep. So like I said, this is a timeline, 10,000 years of cities. And there's been streets for 10,000 years. There's only been cars for 130 years, but there's been streets for 10,000 years. And for the first 5,000 years, people walked on the streets. That's what they were for. They were walking, they were social spaces. 5,000 years ago, we domesticated horses. So you can get pulled behind your horse or ride on top of your horse. And that was for most of the second half of the history of cities. And then about 400 years ago, transit was invented. So we had horse-drawn transit on wooden rails. And then bikes 200 years ago. And then we got good enough at iron making that we could have tracks for trains and trolleys. And about 130 years ago, cars were invented. And then they became popular after World War II, maybe 75 years ago or so. And then they started to dominate. And so we've had 400 generations of perfecting urbanism. And we've had 3 generations of cars being in our cities. And when you think about how cities formed over those 10,000 years, you could make a good argument that the cars have been the most disruptive force on city form ever. Spread cities out, change their metrics. It's huge changes to city making. With 3 generations of experience with that. The first 2 were still enamored with cars and were trying to do everything they can to speed them up. It's just this last generation we're starting to really question, was that a good idea? And so this is one of those trial and error iterations where we're trying to think, okay, maybe that wasn't so good for health and energy and tax base and all sorts of other important reasons. So in hindsight, did it work? Did this post-World War II experiment with cars work? Are our cities more connected? Are they more walkable and comfortable? Are they better places? Are things more convenient to get to? Is it more equitable? Can you take transit all over the city now? So when you look at these sorts of things, no, the cities aren't better today because of it. We've left a lot of populations behind through this specialization of cities for cars. And then from the purpose of streets used to be slow, multi-purpose public spaces. In fact, we had to coin a new term for shared space to imply that because street had been made into a car idea. But streets used to be for socializing, celebration, recreation, place, shopping. It all happened on the street. But today, streets are thought about as travel ways. They've been made into something, a very narrow purpose. And this was done intentionally And one of the key books involved is the Highway Capacity Manual, which was first published in 1950. And in the foreword, for a couple of decades, they used to have an acknowledgement that knowledgeable professionals came together and established a common vocabulary and built in the value judgments. It actually said that in the book, into the language. And so that was the golden age of the car. And so there's no wonder that a lot of our technical language has pro-car, pro-speed biases built in. We'll just go into a few of them. First, an analogy. Some of you might remember the 70s with the women's movement. Well, at the time, there was all of these gender biased terms: fireman, mailman, chairman. It was all male dominated. And the women's movement changed the language to firefighter, human resources, hours, chair, which leveled the playing field. There's still a lot of work to do, but by removing the bias of the language, it allowed more objective consideration of those various issues. Now women are represented in those vocations more than ever before. So they said, I remember my older sister explaining this to me, she said, if we can change the language, we can change the culture. And if we can change the culture, we can change decisions, policies, and outcomes. So she said, language and culture and decisions are all related. And so in transportation planning, we have our own biases. When the streets improve, the curve will be here. Now, that guy may not be biased himself, but because he's using biased language, that lady, that homeowner, thinks he's biased. And the term improvement, when you mean widening, shows a bias for beneficiaries of the widening and a bias against the homeowners, the community, the neighborhood, the urban forest. So why not use widening? There's nothing wrong with objective language. So it doesn't need that subjective baggage. Efficient, to make this more efficient, should add 2 more or 4 more lanes. There are much better words for speed. What we mean when we say efficient, typically in transportation engineering, is speed. We're trying to reduce travel time. We're not talking about resources and land consumption. And so this misleads politicians. It misleads neighborhoods to think, oh, yeah, I agree with efficiency, but they're really talking about speed. We're all for efficiency, but not necessarily all for speed, especially in these days of Vision Zero. Capacity of the street, as if how many cars can cross a line is all that streets can do. Streets have the capacity to nurture businesses, to be great addresses, to be social spaces, to be recreational facilities. Streets have the capacity to do all kinds of things in cities. But my profession decided that the purpose of streets was to move traffic. So they called moving traffic the capacity of the street. And these are subtle things, but it actually affects the way people think and make decisions. And there's lots of other coded language that we use routinely. And what it all does is it emphasizes the movement purpose of streets, the travel purpose, and ignores all those other things. And I think with this generation, is starting to figure that out and trying to reform those things. And the Institute of Transportation just caught wind of this a few years ago, and in 2000 and whatever it was, 17, had me write a paper on it called Removing the Bias. And so they encourage all the cities and jurisdictions and counties and everyone else to adopt objective language, just like the women's movement. So we can have level playing fields when we have our debates and discussions about transportation policy and design projects. Now, traditional planning was normal for 10,000 years. The modernists came out and invented an entire new language, which became the dominant language of the profession. And we had no language to talk about the things that were important traditionally. And so just in my career, these are some of the terms that have come along, like context-sensitive design, smart growth, and complete streets, active transportation. These terms were invented to help defend traditional ideas and cities, because we never needed those terms in 1930 or before, but we need them now. And we need more terms like this to build better cities, to counter the weight of the conventional rhetoric and language. So this is the federal highways, highway functional classification concept. Now, you're going to have to keep in mind for a moment that this is a highway, right? Writing this stuff for cities. So that's the perspective. Right at the very beginning, they talk about traffic in cities as similar to blood flowing through the human body. So it starts through the aorta and it gets through smaller veins and vessels to the capillaries. And they say that's like the transportation system. It's like a tree or a river system, but these dendritic systems. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the way cities have worked or do work. Here's an example. At the top, you've got 5 north-south streets, 4 east-west streets, and they're all 2 lanes. And on the bottom, you've got a 10-lane street and an 8-lane street meeting. Same number of lanes. One is very difficult to cross as a pedestrian. One isn't. And if you're trying to turn left, there are 80 ways to turn left in the top diagram and 4 in the bottom diagram. And if there's an issue in one of those left turn lanes, you've got 79 left in this one, you've got 3 left in the other one. So you'll notice that the dendritic hierarchy is very vulnerable to crashes and incidences in construction and so forth. But a network isn't. And cities have been built on networks since the beginning of time for the right ratio of access to buildable area and communication and exchange. This is Detroit's street network when there was 1.8 million people living in that city. Beautiful urban traditional network, fantastic transit system, very accessible, hugely successful city in terms of culture and manufacturing and all sorts of things. After World War II, they were quite wealthy because not a single bomb was dropped on Detroit, but they made all the stuff that World War II, and they wanted to be the best city in the world. So they spent money on modernism because that was the fashion, and they went in with gusto, I guess you could say. And this is Hastings Street, very successful main street for the Black community. This is that same street, beautiful intact buildings, and I'm just going to point out that church with the yellow arrow, because you'll see it in the after picture. So that's the before picture. Before, there was a single highway in Detroit, or excessively widened arterial road. And that's after, and that's that same church. So that's I-375. And the idea was that that would help people get from downtown to the suburbs quickly. And they, of course, they put it right down the economic, social heart of the community. And it just doesn't kill that one corridor. It actually killed the entire community. So that's that church in the upper left corner where the arrow is again. The entire neighborhood eventually fizzled because of that highway. Now, that's not the only highway. There was a bunch of them, a bunch of big arterials. And what it ended up doing was depopulating Detroit. They had 1.8 million people. And then it went down to 600,000 people. 1.2 million people relocated into the suburbs, becoming car dependent, driving long distances, increasing BMT, using up a lot of farmland. And the people living in Detroit couldn't afford the infrastructure, and the city went bankrupt. One of the wealthiest cities ever, in no time went to bankruptcy because of this failed public policy infrastructure approach. And so 15 years ago, I led the first plan to remove I-375 out of Detroit. And this is the before and after idea. And oh my gosh, I was ridiculed. I was made fun of. My professional license was questioned. Like, it was not comfortable. The head engineer for the city said, "You are nuts. Like, we need this infrastructure in case the 1.2 million people come back." I said, "No, that's why they left. And that's also how they left." Anyway, right over his head. And so a couple of years later, I got a call from the Michigan DOT, and they said, we can't afford to maintain that highway anymore. So it became an economic issue. And then that rolled a little bit. And then last year, Pete Buttigieg announced a $105 million grant to remove I-375. So it's supported by the governor, the secretary, the MDOT. Everybody's on board now with moving it. And I still haven't got my apology yet. And we're getting picked on so much. Anyway, it's coming out. And so we just got hired last week to help them remove it. They've been trying to remove it with a big arterial, but isn't working out. But getting back to this. Cities were never about the dendritic hierarchy. Detroit proved it. City after city has shown that It's about a connected network of streets. And just compare, what's that city? Irvine, California on the bottom left with Savannah. Yeah, Irvine, California uses a dendritic hierarchy of streets. And if there's a crash at that one intersection, that main intersection, the whole thing shuts down. Savannah has a network that's been there since the 1700s, and it works better than the brand new one in California. And then Tampa, you guys had this incredible street network in 1928, which is where that map's from. And then the conventional hierarchy of highways and arterials were imposed on top of that. And I suspect, I'm not an expert on the Hillsborough or the Tampa area, but I suspect all the issues that you're facing now are probably a result of that impression of the dendritic hierarchy on your beautiful traditional network. And every place, even on the very edge of town in that 1928, was accessible through transit with 10 or 15-minute headways all day. Can you say the same thing about your far suburbs today? I bet you the transit isn't even close.
Can't even say about the things that were there at that time.
Okay,
You can't.
so is equity been advanced? Like, has energy use been advanced? Like, is it better today? So you really need to start questioning these things. So this is the decision tree that the feds have in their book. And everything in their mind is a road. Now, in my mind, a road connotes rural. It's a long distance, faster environment. And by calling everything a road, it makes it more appealing that arterial roads are for higher speeds because it has that rural kind of connotation. But again, it's importing a rural idea into a urban transect, which causes the issues. This is Richmond, Virginia. And this is Broad Street. And just look at all the social and economic exchange happening here. There's department stores that people are accessing. There's civic buildings. There's cinemas. There's public buildings. There's houses. There's transit. Everything people want and need is accessible on this street. And it's very vibrant. And that's a map of the area around 1945 or 46. And the black lines are the trolley lines, and the white bars next to the black lines are the 3-minute walk contours. The entire city was a transit-oriented development when you think about it, just like every other American city was, including Detroit, even the big cities, and Tampa. And the role of that arterial was mostly access. All the department stores, the civic buildings, the theaters, people are accessing transit. It was mostly about access. It had a big throughput role as well. Has bigger throughput role than a local street and a much bigger access role than a local street. The local streets only access houses, basically. Everything else was being accessed on the arterials. So Richmond was a traditional city, just like Tampa was, and just about every other American city, until 1949, when they decided to embrace modernist thinking and modernist metrics. And so they decided to tear out that incredible infrastructure they had, which they did, and they turned the arterial street into an arterial road. And so that's the before and after. So it carries more cars faster than it did previously, but mobility actually went down in total, and access went way down. And so that all the shopping doesn't exist anymore. All that access doesn't exist. The transit's compromised. The tax base was diminished. The street became a barrier when it wasn't before. And so these are those two famous Leonardo da Vinci drawings. One is when everything was designed to the human scale, and the second one is when he noticed that everything became a car scale and isn't working out so great. And so there's Richmond when it was a transit-oriented development, basically. And this is it today. And so it's sprawled out all over the place, becoming very car dependent. Jobs are spread out. It's very difficult for people who don't have a car to actually access employment. Again, huge energy issues and health issues related to that, and just consumption of farmland and habitat destruction. So it had a lot of negative ramifications. Now, if the modernist idea that arterials are about, they call it mobility, but it's really throughput, were true, that you don't access them from them, then all that stuff should be accessed off of local streets, not the arterials. So this is the newer parts of Richmond, and you can tell by just the color of the buildings that the market wants access off the arterial. So the grocery stores, entertainment, restaurants, all these sorts of things are accessed off the arterial, not local streets. Even in the new parts, when that theory was popular. And this is Buffalo, same pattern. Portland, same pattern. The arterials are all about access. Even today, Detroit, same thing. Hartford, Hillsborough County, same thing. Your arterials are about access mostly. And then, of course, places like your downtown and some certain districts are as well. But a big part of your economy is on these arterial streets. Except this Publix and mall, which are at the end of a local street. I'm kidding, I did that in Photoshop. That does not exist in real life. Even though all of your policies say that this is what should happen, this just doesn't happen. And so this is in all your textbooks, probably. It might even be in your comp plan, but it's not true. This is a modern theory, which has never been true historically and isn't true today. It's this. This is much more reflective of your history and your reality today. Now, the feds in their book say arterials about mobility and local streets are about access and collectors in between. Now they mix up the idea of throughput and speed with mobility, and we'll get to that in a moment. But that's actually not true. We just looked at that. So it's a couple of the very fundamental assumptions aren't true. They were theories developed around World War II. Now, when I graduated, mobility was the easy movement of people and goods. Interestingly, Florida DOT's definition of mobility is the same. Mobility is about the ease at which people and goods move throughout their community, state, and world. As remove the seaports and airplanes from just talk about ground transportation. It's still about easy movement of people and goods. And their metrics, when you look at their book filled with their metrics, 81% of their metrics are about speed, reducing travel time, fighting congestion. 81% is about increasing speed. It's unbelievable. And they apply it everywhere to all context classifications. Now, having these context classifications is cool, but applying the same definition of mobility is not cool. So this makes sense between cities. Yeah, easy movement's great between cities. But in a city, you get those tragedy of the common problems. And it's not sensitive to that, to any built environment. So a better definition is the population's S apostrophe, capabilities and strategies to move in order to access and provide what people need to live and thrive within the city. And populations means all kinds of people. It's just not motorists. It's folks with disabilities, different genders, different income levels, students, delivery people, truck drivers. All these people have mobility needs. And they don't move just for the purpose of moving. They move in order to do something, like access something, or provide something. And there's a little list of what people actually do when they move. And about 20% of why people move has to do with work. 80% has to do with other things, like going to the doctor or visiting family or something like that. So if we could rearrange our land use, we can actually increase mobility just through land use changes, because your trips are shorter. So this guy figured it out. Hello, mixed land use and density reduce my average weekend trip length by about 85%. So that guy's got everything he needs within about 3 feet on the weekend. So he's got great mobility without a lot of movement. And if we could design our cities more like that guy's man cave, they'll be a lot better off, because lots of people's mobility will go up. And if we think about these things together, lots of different populations getting what they need to thrive and live, it speaks to equity, which is completely different than just speeding up motorists to the suburbs next door. So it's about equity. And when you think of all this together, it advances efficient and effective exchange, which is directly in line with the original purpose of cities. And that's why we need to complete this sort of circle of thought about, this 400 years of trial and error. Got it right in a lot of ways. And that's what I'm suggesting that we rethink today. Getting back to the federal highways functional classification, they equate arterials and interstates in the same part of their tree. In fact, arterial is above interstate highways. Now, if you're a policymaker and you're trying to make policies about highways and arterial streets, calling them the same thing in the same part of the tree is really, really misleading. Like an arterial street and an interstate are so different, they can't be in the same category. This is ridiculous. And it's really misleading to the public if somebody passes a policy about arterials and it includes interstate highways. Like, that's nuts, in my view. Also, for anybody who's into reform, like I am, and livable transportation, it really hampers communication, policy critique, planning, and design when an interstate can be considered a principal arterial. It's just, it boggles the mind. But if you're into advancing motordom and car dependency, it makes all the sense in the world, because your opponents, like me, can't critique it effectively. So we really need to correct this so that we can communicate effectively. We need to separate the ideas of roads and streets. And a road is about getting from A to B, and there's not a lot of relationships on the sides. It can have transit, but usually it's just to get from A to B without stops in between. Streets are part of a place. They're part of a network. There's stuff going on the sides. They also go from A to B, but that's not their only purpose. They have lots of different purposes. And they have transit and they have stops because there's things to do on the way. And in my mind, urban environments are about streets and rural environments are about roads because they reward long distance trip making. And then we have this thing called stroads. This is a Chuck Marohn term. And a stroad is a street that somebody's trying to make into a road by denying access. We call it access management, but lowering access to businesses, which actually reduces mobility for motorists trying to get to those businesses, pedestrians, cyclists, everybody, for the benefit of somebody far away, just to go through quickly. So when you really think about what mobility really means, this idea of penalizing access and arterials, which, as I've shown you, is a huge part of your economy, is counterproductive. So in my work, I try and make arterials more successful economically and socially and more beautiful and identity. And we need to be able to communicate about these ideas separately so we can enact reform and communicate with the public and our decision makers. The Federal Highways document talks about a secondary functional classification. Now, this means you can make your own functional classifications and superimpose it on the one that's out there for what they call external factors, these secondary things, which I don't think are secondary. I think they're primary. Like, can you actually afford to follow sort of the federal idea of rewarding long high-speed trips? And this drawing here shows some work from Urban 3, and they looked at the economies of cities, and those green bars represent how much revenue is generated per acre in urban areas and suburban areas. And underneath, it shows how much their expenses are, so how much taxes are spent on servicing them, building roads and pipes and schools and firefighting, all this sort of thing. And the urban areas generate a surplus of money. The suburbs lose money, and they have to be underwritten by the urban areas. Everyone says, well, we have to keep subsidizing all of these streets because that's where people can afford to live, way, way, way over there. But they're not paying their fair share. Everyone in the city is subsidizing that lower house cost through all this infrastructure and servicing. And Urban 3 has done this analysis for city after city after city around North America, and the pattern's always the same. And I'm sure it's the same here. But the suburbs aren't paying their fair share of taxes, and they're consuming more than they're producing. And as long as that happens, we're going to get this continuous sprawl because it's rational in their self-interest. And until your urban areas can no longer afford that. And then there's the rub. You know, what do you do when you have no money for nice things anymore? And so the infrastructure starts falling apart, and you have some very serious problems. And I think that's already happening in a lot of places. So we need to kind of stop this idea that the suburbs are actually paying their fair share when they're not. You know, you get impact fees and these sorts of things, and we're chasing those fees, but they don't come close to paying for what I call the forever costs. maintaining all this stuff. So we need to stop that cycle because it's not sustainable. This is one of the diagrams out of that Federal Highways book. And it talks about the importance of these big highways and so forth in cities because most miles happen on the fewest miles of street, they think. That may be true, but it actually increases vehicle miles traveled because the distances and the security of using highways always increases your trip length, which violates that equation I was talking about. They also talk about going through urban areas quickly and going from the central business district to the exurbs. So what they're saying here is that we got to keep doing this because they're promoting sprawl. They're literally promoting sprawl here, and you don't have to do that. So they're really pushing that failed theory that value is a function of travel time. Efficiency of travel, again, it's not efficient. The idea of efficiency as a measure of travel time is not accurate. The idea of decreasing access along arterial streets, like this access management idea, the federal government thinks it decreases mobility to provide access to your businesses and stores and so forth, which I don't think is true. And I don't think it's been historically true or true today. This also violates that universal equation. The best cities aren't doing that. They're doing the opposite. And it's not in keeping with what I think is the right term for mobility in cities. They like it. They like these big roads and highways in cities because it allows for higher speeds for long distance travel, which is exactly 180 degrees for the purpose of cities. It's not in keeping with the Vision Zero. It's the tragedy of the commons thing. It violates the equation. They do admit, though, that these ideas came out of the 60s. Now, that I agree with. But I don't agree with them that saying this system is mature. We had 400 generations of trial and error getting urbanism right, and 3 experimenting with motordom. And it's only the last generation we're starting to really question this. And I think there's a lot of issues that need to be corrected. So it's not mature at all. I would suggest this sort of car dependency experiment is in its infancy, and it's going to take probably a couple hundred years to wrestle it under control, make our cities truly livable again. Safety programs. It's kind of interesting that in this thing they talk about there's lots of different ways to increase safety, but it might be more effective on local roads than arterial streets. Like, unbelievable. When you look around anywhere in Florida, where are people getting killed? They're getting killed on the arterial streets, on higher speed streets, and streets are 4 more lanes. That's where people are getting killed, not on local streets. And then the other thing, they call it the safety program. Safety should be just what we do. It should be normal. It shouldn't be a program, an extra, a frill. Fast speeds shouldn't be the driving force. It should be great cities. This arterial down here is about 3 blocks from my house. And I've lived in that house for going on 25 years now. And there's always these little signs that says, please drive slowly. And they mean that someone got killed in that location. And that sign stays there for a year as like a little memorial. And this street, 436 leads to the airport. And it's been upgraded, as they put it, which means sped up. And there's always these little signs along the road. I've never gone down that street without seeing signs that someone's been killed within a year. There's 2 in a row here. There's one just off to the right of this photograph. There's a new one up last week when I went down the street. And so this street is not safe and it's not comfortable, but the engineers who designed it are not liable because that's the way our system works. Now in Vision Zero in Sweden, there's a 4th pillar, which we've ignored. We've made Vision Zero into more like a safety program, but it says the responsibility for the fatalities is a shared thing between the designers, their jurisdictions, and the users. And if the engineers who designed this and posted this street at 50 miles an hour were liable for all of these people getting killed routinely along the street, it wouldn't be 50 miles an hour anymore. It would be slower, the design speed would be slower, it'd be a lot safer and more inclusive. Because they will be held accountable. And same with the jurisdiction who allowed this to happen. So over time, I think the Vision Zero thing is going to get expanded. And everybody in this room who's involved with transportation planning and engineering and so forth is going to think long and hard about designing streets that we know are dangerous and uncomfortable. This is really good stuff. So in the federal book, they talk about the latitude that counties and cities have to design their streets to be context sensitive. You need to exploit this to the fullest. You have a lot of discretion on how you design your streets. You don't have to follow their values or their thinking. You can follow your own. And this is also in the AASHTO Green Book. Incredible flexibility there. All the projects I showed you in this slideshow all meet AASHTO, every one of them. So you have all the flexibility you need. Even back in the 90s, when a lot of these projects were done, you have a lot of latitude. You don't have to do conventional thinking. And then they have a section on livability, and it talks about quiet pavements and transit demand management. But there's so much more to livability that they've left out. And this is something that the county's vision and the city's mission statement and so forth address beautifully. You just need to follow those, and your county and your cities will become much more livable. So this section talks about posting speeds that are appropriate with the level of pedestrian activity that's present, which is kind of implies warrants. Like you have to have so many pedestrians here before you can do the nice street. And I would suggest that it should be that's desired, not there already. Like it's that old joke about before you build a bridge, you have to have so many people swimming across the river. Like you have to decide ahead of time what you want and then build it. And then the this idea that these things about livability are emerging trends, and that travelways are for other modes as well, like walking and biking. Like first of all, they call streets travelways, define that movement role. But anyway, this is not an emerging trend. This existed in cities for 9,900 years. And we went into this sort of amnesia for 2 generations about what cities and streets are about. And it's rediscovering the roots of Tampa and Orlando. And these are all traditional cities for most of their histories. And we're starting to rediscover that those things are actually important, and we need to champion those things. It's not an emerging trend. It's a correction, actually. Urban versus rural. According to the federal guide, anything with over 2,000 to 5,000 people means urban. So in their minds, this is one of Billy's drawings, by the way. That in the top right is urban, but it couldn't be further from being urban. So you can't say the suburbs and the urban areas are the same if you want context sensitivity. This is South Bend, Indiana, when it was a nice city. This picture is just after World War II. Very vibrant city. And this is what it became. It made all the same mistakes as West Palm Beach and others, where we rewarded the long trip, the fast trip. We sped up the arterials, we one-way them. A lot of their buildings were torn down for surface parking lots. Their crime rates went up. Disinvestment, people of choice left. All the sorts of negative trends. Ever since they started sort of modern thinking, they champion this idea of value as a function of travel time and end up exporting their value. That's their main street. 4 lanes, one way. Their big innovation was synchronizing the signals. And they told us, you can go right through downtown and never have to stop. Wow, that's not my kind of main street. It's like unbelievable. And so we had lots of meetings about how they damaged their city, and we created a traditional vision for it. And we led this thing called the Smart Streets Initiative, which you may have heard about. It launched Pete Buttigieg's career. Tons of investment came in South Bend. And this would be typical where we took a big arterial, it's a big 4-lane state road through town. Look at the scale of the light in that left picture. Anyway, it's now a 2-lane, 2-way street with trees and a separated bike facility. And what's that thing on the left at the bottom picture? That's investment. hundreds of millions of dollars of investment came into that place because it was more attractive to people. And now we're preparing to remove this interchange, and it just killed the waterfront of this part of the city. And so we're moving it and recycling parts of it. And when we're done, it'll have a much more connected network with separated bike facilities, a waterfront park, lots of new housing, and all sorts of things that are pro-city. And that one approach to the interchange will turn into this beautiful Main Street. When they widened this approach, it just killed all the businesses along it. Now we're gonna restore it. So Hillsborough County has this fantastic vision about being a preferred community for even more people. The city of Tampa has an equally wonderful mission statement, and they align with the traditional paradigm. So you need to align your vision with the paradigm, and then when you actually get to the ground and start building things, follow those values, not the conventional paradigm. I would suggest using this universal equation as a litmus test for all of your decisions, and it won't be long before your city starts becoming a really great city. The overarching recommendation is to also use your vision and your mission statements as litmus tests. Test everything against it, see if it advances it or not. And then some specifics. I would suggest the most important thing in Hillsborough County and Tampa is actually to adopt an objective transportation language policy and require your staff, their consultants, all your policy documents to use objective language, because it will expose a lot of the built-in biases today and allow regular people an objective playing field to talk about policy and design and planning. The second thing is to re-adopt your value set, because every single time there's a controversy, it's the conventional paradigm versus the traditional. I've used that universal equation. Adopt another model. Pick a city that you love, or a couple of cities that you love, and see what they're doing. And use that to help you with your planning. Use your track demand forecast model for other things, operational things mostly, but from planning, you'll be ahead if you take your cues from other cities. Because then sometimes you're going to violate your model. The model will tell you Carmageddon will happen. But all the cities that I talked about, the model said that. And every single time, without exception, the cities got better. So learn to, when planners think differently than engineers, we like data-driven solutions, just like that tile floor at that art gallery. All that detail may not give you the big picture. Maybe you need to change your perspective and blur the lines and see the relationships. And that should guide you to a much healthier future. Set targets for VMT reduction. Require your engineers, as part of their personal evaluation every year, the professional evaluation, to reduce the VMT per capita and in total. And they can do that through networks, slowing things down, transit system changes, and hold your planners accountable, VMT per resident and employee. So if someone's suggesting to build housing, and if it increases VMT, don't allow it. If it decreases VMT by putting it in a place where there's already transit and jobs and so forth, allow that, because that helps curb sprawl and those forever costs that society can no longer afford. Go ahead and use federal highways for determining your classifications, but use your values and your language and your priorities on your designs that actually affect people and their businesses. Separate the idea of highways and arterials and urban or suburban. Adopt guidelines like MACTO so you have more flexibility. Keep going with your county environmental lands acquisition and buy up some threatened places so they don't get sprawled on top of. Start thinking about tax changes so that there's not a financial incentive to continue to sprawl and underwrite, that sort of forever cost and damage to your environment. And start changing impact fees to correlate with vehicle miles traveled instead of just traffic impact studies. And because things that are getting built way far away are going to cost you a lot of money for a long, long time. And we need to start charging according to that sort of impact. Slow your streets down, particularly your arterial streets. Start slowing them down, just like West Palm Beach. You'll find the city will get better. Trip making will change. keep going with your complete streets effort. I think that's one thing that's going really well in Tampa and Pillsbury County. If you have to make a choice between making a complete street or rewarding high levels of service during peak hours for motorists, pick the complete street because you're including entirely new modes in your system instead of just peak hour convenience for motorists. Go through your capital list of projects and delete the ones that are just purely about car carrying capacity and start investing your money in placemaking and character and multimodalism. And then take lots of before pictures because I've got a lot of before pictures from a lot of my projects. Thank goodness I took them because you wouldn't believe what they were like today. And you'll find that will happen all over Hillsborough County and all over Tampa as you start changing your paradigm from the conventional paradigm that was popularized after World War II to more tried and true traditional paradigm. So that's, I think, about it. Thank you so much for your attention and love to have a discussion. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions from anyone? I'm sure there's a lot there. Appreciate that.
Questions, discussions, protests? Yes.
Are you big into the reduce the parking requirements and stuff too? Is that
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. When you look at Copenhagen and when you look at West Palm Beach from where it was in like the mid 90s to what it became by maybe 2002, a huge change. But it doesn't happen like when you snap your finger. So you have to be sober about this. You have to be pragmatic. Some of the people who I'm up against in all these other cities where I'm working, they try and belittle the movement. And they use a soundbite or something like, yeah, what are we going to remove 6,000 parking lots or parking spaces from downtown? And all their buddies laugh. And success and reform and change is made on the margins. So think about where you're at and think about what you can feasibly change, like your language policy. That's free. You can do that. That's how you make progress. Don't rush out and try the most ambitious project ever. There's lots and lots of ways to do this. And every city is a little different. And you know your cities and your county better than anybody. Think about your pain points and where you want to work. Stop the bleeding, first of all. Stop doing more harm. That's the first thing. And increasingly, you can do more and more ambitious projects. You just got to stop the wrong stuff first and start the right stuff in your own way. And your city will get better and better, and investment will come and people will come. You'll be less car dependent. Your transit will be more successful. Lots of good things will start to happen because you'll have the money for it and you'll have the willpower. But you need to do those things like pick a different model, not just your traffic demand forecast model. But it's all on the margins. So parking reform is part of it. Charging enough for it. All the TDM stuff about cash and lieu and all this kind of stuff. Oh, you can park your car. I'll give you $100 a month, or something like that. All those things are important.
Jay?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. You've been doing this for 30 so years now. So what is the most effective way you've been able to work with the public on these ideas?
So it's 36 years now. Not as long as Billy was here, but long enough. I think the biggest thing is probably awareness and empowerment and involvement. I think the public know a lot more than we give them credit for a lot of time. They're a lot more tuned in to a lot of the issues. And if we can give them the perspective and the patterns like back in that art gallery, then they can make informed decisions. They can give guidance to their elected officials, that they can share their values. I think one of the things that worked best in South Bend, for example, Rust Belt city used to make Studebakers, the market disappeared for that. And at the beginning of that whole Smart Streets initiative, we had a series of shreds, and a big part of it was asking people what their values were. And this is something that we did up on Sly and Waters Avenue with those streets. And we asked people what they like about the area that they want to preserve. And they, oh yeah, and they'll tell you. And what you don't like about it that you want to change. And that's always a good list. So you don't start with that, start with what they like first. And then what's missing that you would like to see created? And they'll come up with a good list. And then what are the sorts of values you would like to be expressed in your public realm? It's kind of like your legacy. How do you want to leave this behind for the people that follow? And those 4 questions kind of ask the same thing from certain angles, and you get a really good idea of what the community values are. And as people who know how to design streets and places, and then you can design something that aligns with those values and show it to them and say, hey, does this make sense to you? And it will, because everyone will see their story and they go, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I was hoping for. It's best not to design something yourself and just show it. We call it design and defend. Hey, I came up with this in a back room. What do you think? And they can't relate. So you make it relatable, and based on what they say, you can tell, is this something I want to do now, or is this something that's more ambitious that I have to do later, or what have you? And it can give you a lot of kind of political backing. Like in South Pasadena, California, we were there last month, and what's going on there is it's only 26,000 people in the middle of the LA County, and everyone's cutting through the city. Like their arterials are like, you've seen the pictures, right? It's jam packed. There's a reason why people say LA's the traffic's terrible, and it's really, really bad. There's one street there, 2 lanes, no turn lanes, 28,000 cars a day. Like, blows your mind about how jammed it is. And they've tried everything else first. It's like Churchill. Americans are great people. They'll do everything else, then they'll do the right thing, And so in LA County, they've done everything they can to accommodate the motorists, and it's literally killing them. Just trying to cross the street, you can't get across the street to go to school. When it's in off-peak, the drivers drive so fast, they roll over their cars into people's yards. It's got to like an epidemically bad traffic situation. So we asked them, is there too much traffic or not enough road? And they said, well, there's too much traffic. I said, do you want to reduce the traffic? They said, yeah. So we showed them that equation. I said, that's how you do it if you really want to do it. They said, yes, we want to do that. And so they have, we were supposed to be working on just 3 of their biggest arterials in town. And they have about maybe 8 big arterials in town. So our policies and suggestions, we're going to affect all 8 now. Every one of them is going on a road deck. We're removing lanes in an incredibly congested area, and we're slowing them all down. And of course, the sort of conventional thinkers are thinking, it's bad now, it's going to be even worse. But it won't be. When you look at Copenhagen, West Palm, and so on, it won't be. All those streets with that space we're creating will be used for bike lanes and nice sidewalks and street trees and so forth. We're capping the car capacity around the whole city. And once you're in it, it will be consistent. So once you're in, you can drive around, just like in Copenhagen and West Palm Beach. But you'll be going slower, which means it's more inclusive and safer. And interestingly, we got support. The public said, okay, we've tried everything else. There's our models. These different, we showed them all different cities. They said, okay, we can do that. So I think the key is just to empower people with the information and their choices. The city staff, the public works people were completely on board. In fact, they were our client, and they licensed us to share this stuff. We said, this is paradigm shifting stuff. And they said, we don't have any choice. And so the conventional ideas aren't working and they haven't worked, and we've tried for 75 years to make them work, and it hasn't worked. So it's unconventional, but this has a chance. And like Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes says, once you've eliminated all the impossibilities, whatever's left, no matter how unlikely, is the truth. And they just simply have to wean themselves off their car dependency. And I don't know any more effective way than like what they did in Copenhagen, places like that. So that's what we're doing. And so soon we've drawn up the cross sections and so forth, and eventually they'll get implemented. And South Pasadena will be less car dependent when we're done. Now they've got 20 years advanced car dependency compared to here. But in 20 years, if you were to take just conventional approaches from now until 20 years, you'll be in the same boat. So the idea is to look at their example and think, okay, let's not spend so much money and get into that deep of a hole. Let's start making changes now. And you can do it like tomorrow. You can start tomorrow. Like this stuff doesn't have to take a long time. West Palm Beach turned from completely car oriented, the big fast one-way streets, to a nice city in like 5 or 6 years. Like we were broke, and then we were a place where people were moving back to with choice within 5 years. So it doesn't take a long time. South Bend turned around right away. Like that hotel I showed you under construction. Those changes were happening while we were still finishing the report. The word got out and people came to the meetings. Developers thought, this is the place to invest. So it started even before the project started getting implemented. So if you have vision and a plan, that attracts people and investment. If you have a vision and no plan, it's called a pipe dream, and it'll never happen. So you need a plan. You need to do something. So the two of them is what helped West Palm Beach and South Bend. And I can name a couple other cities, but that's the key.
Just want to thank you for your presentation. I don't know if you have the book done yet, but I think that would be good. But if you have a copy of you giving this anywhere, like people can look online or anything, just first off. Okay, because I have like 500 people I want to hear this. I was just thinking about people that really this could be so helpful because I mean, I'm not a planner or anything, but it is frustrating that there never was the language or concepts. And I started so many things that you've said, like vehicle miles traveled. Like I keep wondering, can we make that a goal, like in Hillsborough County, to have fewer vehicle miles traveled per capita? Well, I've never heard or whatever. It sounded like if I would say this from my unknowing place, it sounds crazy. And I know I spent 5 years of my life, and those were kind of like 5 years of pretty intense activism 30 years ago, fighting a arterial road widening through my neighborhood. And you know, it's when I first learned about how everything works, and they go, well, we did a traffic study and we have to widen it for more cars. And I go, well, what about the neighborhood that's here? And they all looked at me like, I mean, I was laughed at by about 3 DOT secretaries in my time of doing that. Not to mention that they kept calling it an improvement. And I kept saying, wait, what kind of improvement is this? Why do you call it that? Just like you said, with language, like this isn't an improvement. This is widening. This is destroying a neighborhood that's already been destroyed, or already had significant impacts, like the interstate going through it as well. But yes. And not to mention the I-275, this like that, 600 people came to TPO meetings to try to stop or reconsider, and that just wasn't enough, unfortunately, in this community. The other thing is we have the most underfunded transit system in the nation for a metro area of our size, not by just a little bit, but by huge enduring amounts. And it wasn't even when I said we don't have what we had before. We have 30 routes and 19 of them are hourly. And hardly any even serve the city in any kind of adequate way, much less the outer reaches of the county. And 57% of people in Hillsborough County believed we needed more investment in transit and voted for it. And then we had a Supreme Court of Florida that wiped out that, you know, and I don't know when we'll get back to doing that. So we have some significant barriers. So I'm not sure where I'm going, but you know, the suggestions you've made are very good. I guess we could use, because I feel like we have to use a Florida city. It sounds like West Palm might be a good place for us to be looking at and trying to model. And I know I was there with Brightline the other week at the station there, and it's really significant what the mayor described that they did, and he showed around there. I was very impressed by. I thought he was really good. He had a different kind of, oh, I know. Instead of affordable housing or workplace housing, he called it essential housing, like for essential workers. And I thought it was a great reframing of the language that I wanted to remember. But I think you've done some, this is great information, and I hope that we'll have you back again in some capacities. And so more people can hear this because you put it together so well. But I guess it would be, if we had a city to model, it might be West Palm Beach to look at some of these languages. You know, I'm not the technical person at the county or the person that's involved in this, but I mean, is that something that is that something we can do here, like at the county, or how would that work? I'm just asking.
Well, so West Palm, I don't necessarily you can use it. It's a fine city and it did well. But I would take little bits from different cities, and it's okay to look at cities from far away because there's regular folk too.
Right. I just know we get pushback all the time. Lots.
Yeah. When I was first into traffic calming, I did my graduate work on traffic calming. So when I was trying to do it in the 80s and 90s, people would tell me, well, that's European.
Right.
And then stuff was going on in Portland. Oh, that's the state, because I grew up in Canada, immigrated in the 90s. Oh, that's Portland, it's a different country. And then it happened in Toronto. Oh, well, that's Toronto, it's a big city. And then it happened in the suburbs outside Ottawa, right? Like, well, that's the suburbs. And I said, so until it happens here, it can't happen here. Is that what you're telling me? All these ideas and principles are completely transferable. And I don't know if this was taped, but you can put something like this on YouTube if you want to reference it. You're going to get some pushback based on resources. You're talking about your transit being under-resourced. Keep in mind, West Palm Beach was broke when we started doing this stuff. We were completely broke. We had no tax base to speak of, and we had no reserves. And I would suggest, based on that, that money's an excuse only. We had a city administrator, a very talented guy, Michael Wright was his name, and he said, you plan the coolest streets with whatever you need to plan. He says, there's always money. He says, just a matter of willpower and finding it. And I suspect there is money if you look and prioritize to do these sorts of things. We found it back, and there was no SS4A funding or anything like that. There was no state support for complete streets or anything like that. So it was, I would say it's just harder when you're starting these reforms. And now there's things in place to actually help us. There's language, there's policies. Your Hillsborough County and your city, your TPO, all their policies are fantastic. It's just a matter of making that reflected on the ground increasingly. It's already happening with complete streets and stuff like that. So things are going well in places, but I think you can do bigger and better over time.
One more thing too, definitionally, I thought it was really interesting about arterial versus interstate, because for whatever reason, I just thought arterial was ground level for the major.
Everyone thinks that.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, so the confusion between them, because they should be treated totally different. I mean, we've turned every one of them into Stroads, basically, that I can tell. And, around the city of Tampa or in the county, these vital streets, But the other thing I've always, FDOT has talked about this state policy where, I think I can't ever remember, statutory or something. 50% of all resources are put into interstates, and that's what they look at, and so getting money committed to arterials, especially if you're talking about redesigning them and making them complete streets or any of that, seems as well really difficult. And even some really so obvious streets like Tampa and Florida and Nebraska, which are parallel to the interstate and treated like they're the interstate and speedways. And I live right off Florida Speedway for 22 hours a day. 2 hours, it's got traffic, but otherwise it's just, in fact, that they, for a while during COVID, there were like 5 houses that were hit, that they ran into porches on because of, what was going on with that street. So they've done a little bit of work on it, putting in some bike areas, which now some people in the little space is hard. But,
So setting up for this talk, the staff and I had a conversation about Nebraska, Florida.
yes.
And often what happens is that the interstates are very fragile. If there's a crash, the whole thing shuts down. And so they want these parallel routes so they can reroute all of the highway traffic onto surface streets. So I would suspect that Nebraska and Florida could be much nicer streets, but they're held kind of hostage by this backup highway role that they're given. And so, so one of the things I think we need to do as a group and society is start to question the legitimate roles of these streets. And is that really legitimate to suppress the businesses and the neighborhoods that are affected by Nebraska and Florida, just in case there's a crash, on the interstate? Because it puts this idea that these long distance trips are more important than all these local trips that happen on the local smaller streets, which reminds me of a quick story about these 2 dentists who opened an dentist office in downtown Tampa. And then George, one of the dentists, he lives 30 miles north of Tampa and he drives to work every day. Takes about an hour to get in, an hour to get home. And Jane, his partner, she lives across the street from the dentist office. She walks. Now, those trips are the exact same value to society. There's 2 dentists, each one's going to the office, same value. Yet George is getting hundreds of thousands of dollars of subsidies for an unsustainable behavior, spending gas and pollution and endangering neighborhoods as he comes in. And Jane gets nothing. She's not even counted. She doesn't even get a crosswalk to cross the street. She has to go a block that way because you wouldn't want to slow down George as he's passing through, right? So I think there's this, I have another cartoon that shows the regional travel. It's a euphemism for long distance unsustainable car trips. And so George is part of the problem. He's part of the sprawl problem. He's living way, way far away. And Jane is part of the solution. But we're not funding the solution. The money is going to big highways and big arterials for the Georges of the world. So I think we need to stop funding the problem and start funding the solution. And transit's part of it. There's a lot of things that are part of it. But I've heard stories about new highways getting built near here. There's all sorts of money getting spent on rewarding the problem. And there's so many needs for the solution that are underfunded. So.
And I'll just, there's a huge thing to merge the TPOs in this area, and Spur has their own, Pinellas does, and Pasco does. It's all about the interstates and focusing on the interstates and wanting us to take our non-resource local transit and do transit on the interstates, because that's the only transit that matters, apparently. And, there's already between these locales, there is transit. It's not great, but it's as good as can be, considering too the sparsity transit that we actually,
right.
Scarcity, I should say, of transit that we have in really dense urban areas that could use more, and that, you know, I've even had, I thought, knowledgeable elected officials who said, you know, they're like, oh, but all our transit already goes to this neighborhood or that neighborhood. I said, no, you've got to be kidding me. They get like hourly buses and they're packed, you know? And there's just so many, I'm very frustrated with the issues of this, but thank you for the presentation. I think it was just really excellent and really helpful.
So Wade and I have the difficult time of cutting down the presentation. And there's probably this much more other ideas. There's so much to this. I would suggest we were just scratching the surface on what we could have talked about. But it is so important. But I think those values and stuff are the things you want to take away. And by the way, I took I-4 to come here. And I don't know about you, but in the morning, it was busy. It was congested even. And it's the first interstate in Florida. It started in 1956. And it's still not working.
Right.
Like, they've had 70 years to get it right. And it hasn't right yet. And what is it going to take, another 70, 50?
I've been
Like-
practicing law. I practiced at the immigration court in Orlando. So I'd have to leave here. My hearings would be at 8:30, or could be, you know, depending. And I have to leave here at 6 o'clock to make sure that I'm at the courthouse for 8:30. And that and if I left at 6:15, just slow to move or something, I could definitely endanger that and be late just because. And we all know that all you need is one accident and then you might have 5. But, you know, and then I've spent many a day that I've been in Orlando and tried to get back, this dinner or whatever, because I'm in gridlock for 5 hours on, I didn't know it was the first highway, but
First interstate.
Yeah. first interstate, I mean,
Yeah, sorry.
but that's interesting. Yeah, it's just horrible. And yet, actually, we had our chance at our rail done away with
Well, you know,
years ago.
interstates are they only fail when people need them,
Right,
you know, at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're fine.
exactly.
So the Bright Line came up and compare having a train station unit downtown. Let's say 100,000 people coming in and out of it every day. Now compare it with an interchange with a highway with 100,000 people coming in and out. What is the area like around the train station for those long trips? And what is it like with the interchange? And it's literally night and day. One's got vibrancy and people and mixed use and all this stuff, and the other one is dangerous and hollowed out of people. So there's a paradigm here, and we keep thinking about these interstates of things as must-haves. They're normally, they're too big to deal with, and I think they are big to deal with, but I don't think they're too big to deal with. It's a long-term thing getting rid of those, but and that's not the point of the talk, but because that it's more about your arterials, which are between the highways and everything else. And that seems to be where most people are getting killed. And that's where a lot of your economy is. So I would focus on that for a while. Because there's so much good you can do there for your economy and for your neighborhoods.
Hey, we have other business, so
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think this could go on for another hour probably. At the time, so.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming today. This has been very enlightening, eye-opening, probably all sorts of other terms to use. So very much thank you today.
Thank you again.
Sarah.
Yes, this will be posted on YouTube, or at the TPO's YouTube channels. Yes, Elizabeth is up next. Thank you. I want to thank. And Elizabeth is written. I think highway caps.
Create an easy link for this, please. Thanks.
You said?
I'm sorry, what? Creator?
To this meeting, it's really important.
I'm sorry, do we have some?
No, we just need
Oh,
to mute the attendees. Gail, if you can, I don't know if you can. And then Elizabeth, ready to present on this item.
Okay, I think we should move ahead with the 2050 needs assessment for real choices when not driving. Elizabeth Watkins.
Great. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. What a great meeting so far. And I will be respectful of everybody's time because I know you have 2 action items. So we will get through this as quickly as possible. So the item for your consideration today is the 2050 Real Choices When Not Driving Needs Assessment. This is a really important input to the long range transportation plan, which ultimately prioritizes transportation projects and programs. This needs assessments covers 3 modes: local bus service, the Transportation Disadvantage Program, which is covered by Sunshine Line, and trails and side paths. It's a high level systems level analysis that kind of describes what potential investments could be made under 2 different scenarios. One being the trend. So what's invested in bus service and trails today? And then the second scenario is if we invested more resources, what could we achieve as a community? So one other clarification I want to make on this needs assessment before I get into the details is this was not an activity to determine where bus service should go or where trails should go. We relied heavily on our partners who've done extensive engagement, extensive analysis on those improvements. And essentially what this needs assessment did is it cobbled all of those together and provided a long range needs assessment that could be considered in funding decisions in the long range transportation plan. So we'll start off with bus service. We worked closely with our partners at HART by using their professional expertise as well as their transit development plan, which has its own needs assessment as well as a financial and implementation plan. And we used a variety of different performance measures. One being transit level of service. So how many buses come per hour? So if a bus comes at least every 15 minutes, that's A or B, we consider that frequent service. If it comes at least every 30 minutes, we would consider that somewhat frequent service with transit level of service, C or D. Or if there's 60 minutes or greater or no service at all, that would be minimal or no service. And then we also analyze the different scenarios based on the number of people and jobs served. So here's a map of the existing HART service. And as I think you heard Commissioner Kemp mention earlier, about 2/3 of HART system is about an hour service. But there are some pretty high performance routes specifically close to the urban core. So about 33% of the lane miles of the routes have frequent service, and about 29% of the routes 29% of population and jobs are covered within a somewhat frequent service and a greater amount where there is that hourly service like you could expect. And the current budget operations and capital for HART is about $160 million per year. So what does it look like if HART's TDP was fully implemented? So that means that it's financially constrained. They've looked at the numbers, they've identified grant opportunities, they've found service improvements. This is essentially what could be delivered by 2050. Higher frequency on certain routes, a higher percentage of people and jobs served, particularly with that frequent 15-minute service or better. And using a recent study from the the American Public Transit Association, there is a 5-for-1 impact on every transit dollar spent can generate $5 million or $5 in economic returns, whether that's cost savings for individuals who shift from TNCs or taxis to transit, or cost savings from car ownership or congestion reduction. So we thought it was important to kind of highlight that economic benefit of investing in transit. So in order to deliver a system that looks like this, with this a spread of transit frequency, it would cost about $280 million per year, which also includes, inflation, a year of expenditure analysis, but roughly a doubling of what is currently spent today to operate the transit system into the future. And then the second scenario was that unconstrained vision investment. Based on all the community input, based on data analysis on where service is really needed, this is HART's essentially kind of dream plan, having higher frequency on many more routes throughout not only the urban core in Tampa, but throughout the county, having 14 different new routes and local express routes, which would also include regional service from Tampa to Lakeland, Tampa to Land O'Lakes, Tampa to Clearwater, and then growing their circulator program to provide more service. So this is kind of the Cadillac of what would be desired to be implemented in Hillsborough County by 2050, with about 57% of countywide population and jobs being within frequent service. But the cost to do that would be about $445 million a year, so almost a tripling. So there would definitely need to be a greater investment in our transit service if the needs were to completely lead the conversation on what transit improvements should be done for our community. So the second mode is transportation disadvantage. Again, Sunshine Line operated by Hillsborough County. And there's sort of an inverse relationship between Sunshine Line and then HART service. So with the greater investment in HART service, you see less of a need or less demand for Sunshine Line. And the reason that is Sunshine Line really provides that service that's a gap in the system. So they serve where HART local service and HART paratransit service doesn't exist. So it is incredibly important to service for our most vulnerable in our community, that provides trips to, the doctor, the grocery store, those types of things where there aren't any other options. So if you have a greater investment, say the vision scenario, then you would have less of an investment in Sunshine Line because there would be a robust local bus service and then an even greater paratransit service that could pick up those trips. So Sunshine Line could focus in those areas, probably in the more rural areas. And then lastly is the trail and side paths in Hillsborough County. There are about 205 miles of side paths and trails. And the way that we define these for the purpose of this study is, one, it has to be separated and protected from traffic, and it has to have a bi-directional flow. So the Jackson Street the Jackson Streets cycle track would be included, or our trails. But what would not be included are like any kind of just non-protected green bike lanes, or any non-paved trails were not included in this analysis. So I wanted to point out a few big differences between the last long range plan and this long range plan. In the 2045 plan, there are only 53 proposed trail projects. But since our partners at Hillsborough County are, I think, actively working and getting close to finishing their Greenways master plan, there have been a significant number of projects and a significant number of miles added, which is fabulous. But that means that the full build out of this envisioned trail system would be about 600 miles, And having that would triple the number of people within a trail within a fourth of a mile from their home. Another difference between the 2045 and the 2050 plan is the way that the TPO is estimating costs. So previously, we just used a planning level estimate of a little less than $1 million only for construction, or about 150 miles. While in this plan, we're proposing to use a $3 million per mile planning level estimate to be more comprehensive of all of the costs that are included in delivering a trails project. So PE, land acquisition, any structures, any crossings, and also construction. So that doesn't mean that every project will be $3 million per mile. You know, it's just a planning level estimate to get us to that systems level understanding of what's that ballpark number to deliver the trail system. And given that there are so many great projects now that have been identified and so many needs, we thought it would be important to bring to the committees and the board a few different project delivery approaches for your consideration. The first of which is prioritizing funding for planned trails and side paths along regional priority corridors. So saying, okay, let's make that commitment to fund Upper Tampa Bay Trail, the Tampa Bypass Canal, and the Florida Gulf Coast Trail to have more connections within the trail network and having more of that connectivity. By doing these larger segments, we can have benefits system-wide for other connections. And the second project delivery approach is, what if we prioritize trail investments in our areas that are historically underserved, our communities of concern? So running the numbers and using that $3 million cost per mile for each of those three scenarios. So the building out the full network, building out only the regional priority corridors, or only building out the trails through communities of concern, we've put together a summary table of what that total cost would be to implement through 2050, and then the years required to complete it. So you can see in this first table, hundreds, almost thousands of years to implement that based on the current level of spending today. So realizing that that's not very helpful, that it's hundreds of years or thousands of years, we present another scenario in this bottom table. So if we increased our investment to $5.6 million per year, we could build out all 600 miles in 200 years. Still not a great story, but our regional priorities trails, we could do that within the lifetime of the plan, or almost 29 years, and trails through communities of concern in 57 years, based on a significant investment, but not something that would be unreasonable based on increased Sun Trail funding and based on community desires to have a trail network. And then we also ran the numbers to say, okay, through all three scenarios, what if we were to commit to investing in these three scenarios through 2050? What would that cost? So to deliver the whole 600 trail network, it would be about basically $50 million per year. If we were to focus solely on those three regional corridors, it'd be about $6.4 million per year, and then $12.8 million per year for the trails through communities of concern. So still a pretty high bar, but we just wanted to provide the numbers for our committees, for the public and the board to be aware of what those needs are, what the costs are, and what would need to be done to move the needle. So the action before you today is to approve the draft 2050 plans and needs assessment for Real Choices When Not Driving and forward to the TPO board for consideration. And I would be happy to answer any of your questions or take your comments.
Okay, any questions? Sorry, Sarah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to share with the committee, because I know some of this includes the Greenways Master Plan vision, which is draft, as Elizabeth mentioned. And we have been working on that. The Board of County Commissioners has not adopted it yet. So we're going to be meeting I think with Elizabeth and her team, just to talk about it, because we do have some different assumptions when it comes to cost and things like that. So just for the sake of the committee's understanding, we are kind of talking about that, but we do have that very extensive vision in the vision plan. It's the first time that the plan's been updated since 1995. So it has been a very long time since the Greenways Master Plan was updated. So we are still working through some things, but we really appreciate it being considered, and we'll talk through some ideas of how that happens since the Board of County Commissioners hasn't a job to take yet.
Just following up on her, it may be premature to do this today until Sarah and the other organizations work with their elected officials to get their document, which fits into this document.
If I may address that, we were under a very tight timeline for the long range transportation plan, and I just don't know that we can wait for the Greenways plan to be adopted. It's a very high level assumption, and that is the implementing document.
I'll just say our hope is that the Board of County Commissioners will see it in early 2024. The Greenways Committee, if anyone's interested, the Hillsborough Greenways Committee is being asked to take action on it on Wednesday evening at 5:30 here in the 18th floor in 1827 West and on Teams. So we are very hopeful that in early 2024 the board will see it.
Will this be adopted in the comprehensive work efforts?
The Greenways Master Plan is not currently part of the comprehensive plan.
And that's not planned to be part of it.
We have not discussed it yet, but it certainly could be discussed.
Any other discussion?
Well, yeah, this is Jay Collins. I'll make a motion to approve the draft 2050 plan needs assessment for real choices when not driving forward to the TPO board for consideration.
Jonathan Scott, second.
So we had a motion by Jay, Jonathan with a second. Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Oh, I'm sorry, Bob. Opposed? Motion carried 8-1. Okay, because of the time, I think we want to move to item C, which is the calendar first, and then we'll come back to B.
Yes, sir. You may have seen the calendar in your agenda packet. There were also some copies up there if anybody hasn't seen it. We have looked over to try and avoid any conflicts with holidays or anything else, and it is here for your consideration.
Any questions or discussion? Nope. We have a motion.
Jay Collins, motion to approve the 2024 draft meeting calendar.
Second.
Sarah gave her a second.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Motion by Jay, second by Sarah. Any other questions? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carries. Item B, I need to leave at a 3:30 appointment. So I guess we could just do that as an information item. We can provide feedback. But we just don't vote.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, excuse me, Vice Chair.
Yes.
We skipped the approval of minutes.
If we can defer that to next month, that would be helpful as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Jay, would you mind taking the gavel?
All right, yeah.
I don't know if it affects the forum, but I got a 4 o'clock meeting. I'm on.
We've already lost the quorum. If you need to take off, you can do that.
All right, so we're going back to number B. It will not be an action item. It will just be for information. It is the 2050 plan needs assessment for good repair and resilience. Dr. Pedro Sergios from, I'm sorry, I probably butchered that, from Cambridge Systematics.
And I believe Connor, Travis McDonald will be presenting in a step.
All right. Hi, Connor.
Hello, let me just share the screen. All right, the needs assessment for state of good repair and resilience establishes the current and future needs of the transportation system, focusing on pavement, bridge, and transit assets, while considering the resilience of these assets against potential challenges. Here to present is Dr. Pedro Sergios, Dr. Serios is an infrastructure management specialist using his expertise in statistical analysis and modeling asset performance and traffic data to support transportation asset management and system performance improvement. This is Connor Treos McDonald for the record, and I'll leave for the slides from Dr. Serios, and with that, I'll leave it to him.
All right, thank you, Connor. Can you all hear me okay?
We sure can, sir. Sure.
Okay, okay, thanks. I'll try to go fast. I know we are past the scheduled time. So I'm Pedro Serios. I'll be presenting today the Hillsborough TPO 2050 LRTP needs assessment for state of good repair and resilience. Next slide, please. So this is the outline for today. I'll start with a brief overview of the objectives of this project. I'll go over the data and assumptions that we use for the needs assessment analysis. Next, I'll cover the results of the needs assessment, going for each assets, payment assets, bridge assets, transit, and then resilience improvement needs. After that, I'll discuss the main conclusions from this analysis, and at the end, I'll open for discussion to discuss any questions you may have. Next, please. All right, so the objective of this project was to perform a state of good repair and resiliency analysis as part of the 2050 LRTP update. This involved an analysis of the current and future needs to achieve state of good repair of payment, bridges, and transit assets, and an assessment of investment needs to increase the resiliency of assets to natural disasters and extreme weather in the Hillsborough County region. So for these, the first step consisted of gathering the data for the needs assessment. So the first step was to request payment, bridge, and transit asset data for each agency stakeholder, including the condition, maintenance, cost, and budget information. And then whenever there was a gap in the data, whenever data was not available, we fill these gaps with assumptions informed by official documents, such as the Florida DOT and the HART Transportation Asset Management Plans, and also inventory data from bridges from the Federal Highway Info Bridge website. Also, we also have these one-to-one meetings with each agency stakeholders to make sure that the data request was clear and to validate the assumptions we made for the needs assessment. Next one. Thanks. All right, so in the next couple of slides, I will be talking about the results from these needs assessments. For each asset, we performed the analysis looking at two spending levels. The trend spending level consisted of assessing the impact to the condition of the assets, assuming that the current or existing spending level continues to 2015. And for the performance spending level, we estimated the additional funding required to achieve the state of good repair. So in this case, for payment assets, the current spending is 136.2 million annually for payment preservation, and these budgets results in only about 28% of the roads achieving the goal to be resurfaced every 12 to 20 years. These are the targets set by each of the agency stakeholders. This gap, this funding shortfall varies significantly across the stakeholders. Typically, FDOT had a known to very small gap compared to the other agencies, right? All right, so then when calculating the additional funding sources, we found that the additional budget needed to be able to resurface all the roads within the target resurfacing circle is 86.9 million annually. With this, a typical road will be resurfaced in average once every 18 years. Next one. Okay, so for bridge assets, we found that the current spending is 19 million annually for bridge preservation, and this spending results in 72% of the bridges achieving the goal of rehabilitation every 4 years. And again, this funding shortfall varies significantly across stakeholders. The additional funding needed to preserve all the bridges within the target preservation cycle is 7.4 million per year. Next one. Right. For transit assets, we focus on buildings and on the bus fleet. right? So and it's important to note that HART has been operating in a scaled back service. So the fleet size is 32% smaller than the one reported in the last needs assessment from 2019, right? So for bus stop, for buses repair and replacement, the current budget is 12 million per year, and that budget is enough to maintain the current fleet of 132 buses less than 10-year-old. So 10-year-old is the useful service life benchmark by the Federal Transit Administration. Now, when looking at the condition of the buildings, we found that the administration and the heavy maintenance buildings are overdue for replacement. They past their end of the service life, and they are in marginal condition. So in terms of the performance spending level, we found that like the trend or the current fleet spending level might be sustained to meet the FDA recommended benchmarks, and the need for buildings is over 105 million of backlogs to replace these, mainly these two buildings, administration and heavy maintenance. Next one. Okay, so for the resilience improvement needs, what we did was to look at, we used data from the Resilient Tampa Bay study from 2020. For that study, there were 71 miles that have been identified as critical assets for the mobility of the region, and that were moderately to highly vulnerable to extreme weather. So we focus on these 71 miles. So for the current spending level, there is a budget of 1.6 million per year for stormwater improvement and 82.3 million for road maintenance. Now, when looking at these 71 critical roads that are moderately to highly vulnerable to extreme weather, we found that the additional budget needed to do stormwater improvements on these roads would be 14.8 million per year for the 20 years. And to make these roads more resilient, including treatments such as hardening of the pavement and subbase, raising the profile of the road, and the shoreline preservation, the additional budget is 67.4 million for the 20 years. So if you see this, like it's a significant portion of the entire current budget for road maintenance. Not all of them are considering resilience improvements, right? And the need for stormwater resilience improvement is much greater than the whole budget allocated to stormwater improvements. Next one. All right, so the main conclusions from this study were divided in three. The first one for pavement and bridge assets, the overall current spending level is insufficient to maintain the pavement and bridges to reach their target preservation cycles, and the need is an additional 94 million per year to achieve the goals of resurfacing the pavements every 12 to 20 years, depending on the targets of each agency stakeholder, and all bridges rehabilitated at their target rehabilitation cycle. In terms of transit, we found that there is over 105 million of backlogs in transit building maintenance, including a heavy maintenance facility, which is in marginal condition and is critical for the functioning of the HART operations, and that the current spending is sufficient to maintain the current bus fleet. Again, this bus fleet had a big reduction from the last night's assessment of 32% smaller bus fleet. And we put a note there that additional analysis will need to be conducted if the bus fleet increases again. In terms of resilience needs, we found that the current spending on stormwater only accounts for 11% of what's needed to improve the 71 miles of critical roads that are vulnerable, and that the funding needed to harden the critical roads are about 82% of the entire budget currently assigned for road maintenance. Next one. So the recommended action today is to approve the 2050 long-range transportation plan needs assessment for a state of good repair and resilience, and recommend approval for the TPO board.
All right, thank you, sir. We really appreciate the presentation. That was very thorough. We do not actually have a quorum, so we will not be able to take action today, but do we have any comments or questions from the group for either Pedro or for Connor?
Would just offer that probably everybody in this room, as a professional working in this sphere, knows that these funding issues, it's not too surprised.
Yeah. So wait, this will be an item then that will return in the new year for us to take action, or is this a note, we will not be taking action on this due to the RTP?
That is correct, and this will be going to the board in 2 weeks.
Okay. All right, fair enough. All right, well, then again, thank you very much for that conversation. If there is nothing else, we can move on to old business and new business if there is any. Anything? None?
Seeing none online, and none from me.
All right, then we are adjourned. Thank you.
And thanks, everybody.
Bye, thanks.
For rest. I think I'm gonna have to, this, where